Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the channel where history gets weird but the voice stays calm. Tonight we're exploring stinking history, the personal hygiene of Elizabeth Young. A quiet little trip into the scented fog of the Tudor court, where soap was suspicious, water was dangerous, and perfume was political strategy. Did a queen's power really depend on how well she could hide the smell of her own humanity? It's a fair question. And like most royal matters, the answer is complicated, absurd, and faintly perfumed with tragedy. But before you settle in and get cozy, please take a calm moment to like the video or subscribe, only if you truly enjoy falling asleep to humanity's bad decisions. And when you're ready, drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's oddly comforting to know how many of us are awake at the wrong hour, each in our own little corner of history. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's wander gently into the perfumed world of Queen Elizabeth II, a woman who ruled with intellect, iron, and a great deal of scented linen. If your mind drifts along the way, that's perfectly fine. The court will still be here, quietly waiting, somewhere between candle smoke and lavender oil. The story begins not with a crown or a sword, but with a smell. You can almost sense it as the doors of Hampton Court open. A slow exhale of incense, roasting meat, beeswax candles, and a damp sweetness that comes from too many people and too few windows. It is the fragrance of power trying not to notice decay. To understand what clean meant in Elizabeth's England, you must first forget everything you know about hygiene. In the 1500s, water was not trusted. Doctors warned that warm baths opened the body to invisible vapours. Illness, they believed, travelled through bad air, what they called miasma. It wasn't exactly science, more like theology with a faint whiff of vinegar. So instead of washing the body, they washed the air. Rooms were fumigated with burning herbs. People carried little balls of ambergris and cloves called pomanders, like portable air filters for the soul. And the Queen herself lived inside what could only be described as a carefully perfumed illusion. Every corridor, every cushion, every glove was part of a national project. To prove that the ruler of England did not sweat. In that world, scent was not a detail. It was a doctrine. To smell clean was to be moral. To stink was to be suspect. Perfume was, in its own way, a sermon about virtue, just one that happened to contain animal musk and the occasional hint of civet. Elizabeth understood this perfectly. She'd been raised among people who believed the body was a fragile sack of humours, easily invaded by the atmosphere. Her doctors prescribed not baths, but good airs. So she surrounded herself with them. Sachets of rosemary, bundles of dried lavender, and long silk hangings that trapped the fragrance of burned juniper. The palace became a laboratory of controlled odour, part chapel, part compost heap, and entirely royal. You might imagine the Queen rising in the morning, stepping into that fragrant fog and thinking of it as armour. After all, this was a woman who ruled alone in a court filled with men waiting for her to falter. Scent became her invisible crown, an aura of control, radiating confidence, disguising fear, and yes, disguising other things too. If you listened closely, you could hear the contradictions. Outside the gates, London reeked of tanners' pits, horse dung and open drains. Inside, courtiers sprayed the air with orange water and argued about poetry. Between them was a wall of perfume, a literal class divide carried on the breeze. For ordinary people, soap was rare and expensive. For the Queen, it was practically suspicious, a thing to be used with caution. Instead, her linens were changed constantly, each shift of fabric treated with herbs and vinegar to draw out impurities. Cleanliness was achieved not by removing dirt, but by moving it somewhere else. And in a symbolic sense, that might be the most Tudor thing imaginable. Her physicians noted that sweet airs were as vital as prayer. They burned resins and myrrh to purify her chambers. If she ever coughed, The staff blamed the weather, not the sanitation. And whenever the air grew thick, someone lit more rosemary and declared the problem solved. The irony, of course, is that all this fumigation probably made the air worse. Herbs, smoke, animal oils, all layered into an atmosphere that could have stunned a small bird. But it was the smell of stability, and the people of England would have rather breathed poison than uncertainty. Perfume was politics. When ambassadors visited, the Queen's presence was announced not only by trumpet but by scent. Letters describe rooms so thick with rose and musk that visitors felt dizzy. To modern noses, it would have been overwhelming. To them, it was divine. Every choice, every pomander, every scented glove reinforced the image of an untouchable body. In a world terrified of contagion, she made her flesh seem incorruptible. Her humanity was airbrushed away, one puff of jasmine at a time, and perhaps that is the real secret of her cleanliness. It was never about hygiene, it was about holiness. A perfumed court was a moral court, or at least one that smelled like it. And as long as she remained the best-scented person in the kingdom, she remained its rightful queen. As we drift further into the story, that illusion of fragrant divinity will begin to show its cracks. In her baths that weren't quite baths, her linens that did the work of soap, and the strange chemistry that turned beauty itself into a quiet form of self-destruction. But for now, you can almost breathe in the royal air, part incense, part myth, and part denial. A scent that said to the world, I am England, and I do not stink. You might think that after all that perfume, someone at court would eventually suggest a bath, but in Elizabeth's world, stepping into a tub was almost an act of medical recklessness. Doctors warned that hot water opened the body like a door, and anything could walk in. Disease, bad air, or divine punishment disguised as a draft. To be soaked was to be vulnerable. To stay dry was to stay alive. So cleanliness moved from water to fabric. The Queen's laundresses, an invisible army of quiet women, became her guardians of purity. They boiled linen in lavender, rinsed it in vinegar, and dried it in the open sun until it smelled faintly of herbs and safety. These garments, layers upon layers of them, were the Queen's daily defence against decay. Every morning began with a small ritual. Yesterday's linen peeled away like a tired skin, new linen pressed gently to the body, cool, fragrant and symbolic. There's a peculiar logic here. Each change of fabric was a form of confession. Dirt, sweat, and sin were not washed off, but absorbed by the cloth, then sent away to be purified by boiling water and servant labour. In this theology of hygiene, water was fine, as long as someone else touched it for you. Elizabeth's personal linen could weigh several pounds when layered correctly. Chemises, ruffs, and smocks, all tied, buttoned, and pinned by attendants trained to work in near silence. Their hands moved with the reverence of priests preparing a sacred altar. And in a sense, that's exactly what they were doing. Maintaining the illusion that the body beneath was untouched by the world. For the Queen, linen wasn't just comfort. It was identity. Pure white cloth against the skin meant moral order. Coloured dyes or rough fabrics were for the ungoverned. She often gave perfumed handkerchiefs as gifts, tiny tokens that smelled faintly of control. And courtiers, eager to imitate her, began changing their own linens with a devotion that bordered on panic. It was the Tudor version of trend following, cleanliness as performance art. If you'd visited the royal laundries, you'd have seen the price of that illusion. Huge vats of water steaming in the open air, the hiss of lye, the slap of wet cloth on wood. Women worked from dawn until candlelight, hands raw, lungs full of vinegar fumes, every piece of linen tagged for rank. The Queen's sheets alone required their own staff. To wash the fabric that touched her body was to participate in politics. Even laundry carried hierarchy. Her physicians sometimes recommended light rinsings, a delicate term for wiping the body with a cloth dipped in herbal water. Rose, sage, marjoram, and vinegar were the preferred ingredients. Their scent meant to chase away invisible illness. Imagine the scene: a basin of warm water steaming faintly, attendants dipping, folded linen wringing it out until it was barely damp, then passing it slowly over her arms, her neck, her face. No splashing, no soap, no haste, just careful maintenance of royal skin, moist enough to please, dry enough to survive. To modern ears it sounds absurd, but the reasoning had its poetry. If bad air could enter through the pores, then good air might heal the soul. So the Queen's chambers were constantly infused with scent, burning cedar, crushed thyme, and sometimes vinegar heated over coals. Her body was a small weather system of fragrances: linen, herb, smoke, and power. Every breeze that passed through those rooms carried both cleanliness and propaganda. For those who served close to her, this was a sensory education. A maid once described the smell of the royal bed as sweet, though heavy. The mattress stuffed with down, the sheets warmed by proximity to the throne's occupant, the faint trace of lavender and candle soot. It was an aroma that meant safety to some and suffocation to others. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the fires were low, the Queen's chamber would have smelled like a garden trapped inside a furnace. Elizabeth herself occasionally ordered bathing garments to be prepared, loose linen robes meant for half baths, never full immersions. She might sit in a wooden tub lined with fabric, water perfumed with mint and marjoram, attendants standing by with towels and vinegar bowls. But it wasn't bathing as we understand it. It was more like politely negotiating with moisture. You let the steam approach, but never quite touch your authority. Even her towels were part of the ritual. They were embroidered with tiny floral emblems, often initialed and perfumed before use. Each one signalled that purity was a process, not a state, and as soon as a towel fulfilled its duty, it vanished back into the whirl of laundry to be boiled, bleached, and re-sanctified. The smell of all that cleansing never entirely left the court. Visitors commented on the constant haze of perfume, herbs, and burning tallow. To them it was elegant. To us it might have smelled like someone trying very hard not to admit what a palace full of people actually produces. Still, it worked. When Elizabeth appeared before her subjects, draped in layers of clean white, she looked like an icon carved from light itself. No trace of sweat, no stain, no suggestion that the body beneath could ever fail. The linen did the work of both soap and faith. It made her untouchable. The irony is that this obsession with fabric changed fashion itself. England became a land of whiteness. Collars, cuffs, gloves, all glowing against darker gowns. The richer the household, the paler the laundry. And behind every spotless sleeve was an army of servants boiling away the evidence of human life. It's easy to laugh, but the logic still lingers. Modern perfume ads promise transcendence. Detergent commercials preach moral renewal. We've replaced vinegar with chemistry, but the idea is the same. To smell right is to be right. Elizabeth just happened to turn it into statecraft. As the candles burn lower and the linen dries by the hearth, you can almost feel the calm perfection she cultivated. A body untouchable by filth, surrounded by layers of air and cloth, kept separate from the world it ruled. From here, the story carries us toward the bath that wasn't really a bath, the myth that grew around it, and the strange comfort of believing that purity could be manufactured with enough fabric and fear. If we follow the thread a little further, we reach the royal bath, or rather, the polite idea of one. It wasn't the sort of long, steamy soak you might picture. It was a negotiation between cleanliness and caution, halfway between medical treatment and superstition. To bathe in Elizabeth England was to enter a moral debate with water itself. When the Queen ordered a bath, servants didn't fill marble basins or turn golden taps. They rolled in a wooden tub lined with linen so the royal skin would never touch the bare wood. Buckets of rainwater were warmed by fire and poured in carefully as though the water might take offence. Herbs were added for safety: mint, marjoram, rosemary, chosen less for scent than for their reputation as guardians against invisible harm. There might be a pinch of salt thought to close the pores, a few petals of rose for good measure, and perhaps a drop of vinegar, because vinegar seemed to fix everything. It was bathing by negotiation. The water allowed near, but not trusted. Soap, when used, was mild and uncertain. The harsh English lye-burned skin and imported Castile soap was rare and expensive. For someone as conscious of image as Elizabeth, burning one's face in the name of purity was not an appealing prospect. So instead of lather, the Queen used mixtures of bran or crushed almonds, not to cleanse exactly, but to reassure. Her attendants would rub these pastes gently across her arms and neck, then rinse them away with a damp cloth before the skin could absorb the air. The bath itself was brief. The Queen sat wrapped in linen so no part of her touched the water directly. There was no splashing, no leisure. Steam rose in quiet curls. The air smelled faintly of mint and damp wood. It was less about cleaning the body than comforting it, a ritual designed to reset the spirit after illness or ceremony. And once the Queen stepped out, the real work began. Servants rushed to wipe her dry with towels steeped in scented water. Warm, but never too warm. A lady-in-waiting would present fresh linen garments, each layer perfumed, pressed, and pre-warmed by the fire. In this gentle choreography, hygiene merged into theatre. Every motion was symbolic. Purification without exposure. Contact without vulnerability. Rumour later claimed that Elizabeth only bathed once a year, whether she needed it or not. It's a line that survives in many history books, mostly because it smells good to the imagination. But it isn't true. No record of the phrase exists in her time. In reality, she bathed when she chose to, which was occasionally and very carefully. The myth likely arose from envy or propaganda, the same way modern tabloids invent personal habits for queens they've never met. The truth is stranger and more revealing. Elizabeth didn't fear dirt. She feared imbalance of body, air, or reputation. Her world believed that sickness came from what you breathed, not what you touched. So washing the air around the body made more sense than washing the body itself. A bath, then, was a moment of daring. It meant trusting the elements to behave. Imagine the scene after her rare bath. The wooden tub, heavy with used water, was carried away and emptied into the palace gardens. The chamber windows were thrown open, and servants burned juniper to refresh the air. The smell of herbs and vinegar mingled with that of damp linen and tallow candles. The Queen sat near the fire, wrapped in a robe that smelled faintly of smoke and rose petals. Around her, the court whispered, some in awe, some in disbelief, all pretending that bathing was perfectly ordinary. Even the equipment was treated with care. The tubs were dried, wiped with vinegar, and stored in special closets. A few were painted or gilded, as though to remind everyone that even the idea of washing was still a luxury. For most of England, bathing meant standing in a stream and hoping for sun. For the Queen, it was an act of state, approved by doctors, managed by servants, and observed with reverence. Her last known full bath was probably taken during a summer progress, when the heat became intolerable even for royalty. The chronicles mention a wooden vessel filled with sweet herbs. It's easy to picture her then, a solitary figure surrounded by attendants holding towels, her pale face framed by steam and candlelight. The water reflects the flicker of the fire, the scent of rosemary hangs in the air, and for one rare hour the most powerful woman in the world allows herself to be human. But even here, the illusion remains. The attendants who handled the bath water later reported that the scent clung to their hands for days. It was said that Her Majesty's perfume did not fade. Whether they meant it literally or metaphorically hardly matters. In the Tudor mind, to smell of the Queen was to share in her grace. There is something quietly haunting about that. The bath that wasn't really a bath became a kind of miracle. The attempt to cleanse without surrender, to be human without seeming so. It was an act of control disguised as self-care. The irony, of course, is that the water probably did her more good than harm. Fresh air, steam, warmth, all would have eased the aches of court life. But fear is a stubborn perfume. Once it seeps into your clothes, it's hard to wash out. By the time her ladies carried away the damp linens, the room was already returning to its usual equilibrium of smoke, spice and ceremony. Outside, the palace servants dumped the cooled water into the soil, and perhaps, just for a moment, the roses at Hampton Court smelled faintly of royal courage. Our quiet exploration now turns to the fabrics that followed her everywhere. Garments too valuable to wash, too sacred to discard, and yet too human to remain untouched by time. In them, the scent of the monarchy lingered longer than any perfume could. Our quiet exploration now turns to what happened after the water faded, when cleanliness became something you wore. In Elizabeth's world, fabric did not simply clothe the body, it held the memory of it. Each garment remembered warmth, perfume, and the faint trace of every movement. To change clothes was to rewrite identity. And for a queen who ruled through image, her wardrobe was nothing less than a living archive of control. A Tudor gown was a small architectural wonder. Layers upon layers, undergarments of linen, petticoats of silk, farthingales stiffened with whalebone, bodices covered in velvet, brocade or cloth of gold. Every layer had weight. Each fold carried the scent of herbs and the touch of dozens of hands who stitched, brushed, and perfumed it into obedience. When she walked, the sound of rustling silk was not just fabric moving, it was power announcing itself. The air changed when she entered a room, and yet beneath all that magnificence, there was a secret problem. Most of these clothes could never be properly washed. Velvet shrank, gold thread tarnished, dyes ran like wounded soldiers. So instead of washing, they refreshed. Servants brushed dust from hems, aired gowns by open windows, and stored them among dried lavender or orange peel. When stains appeared, they were hidden with embroidery, lace, or new jewels. A good tailor was also a good liar. Even the smell of royal clothing had its own hierarchy. New fabrics carried the scent of the merchant, wool oil, dye, the sea. By the time they reached the palace, they were fumigated with spices and rosewater until no trace of trade remained. A royal garment was expected to smell of virtue, not labour. The perfume hid not only sweat, but social class. You could say that Elizabeth's wardrobe was England's first air freshener. The Queen's favourite gowns were often reused for years, altered again and again to fit new fashions. They were more alive than they looked. Each carried the ghost of earlier reigns, bits of Henry VIII's splendour stitched into new modesty. She treated her clothes almost like courtiers, rewarded, repurposed, occasionally executed. And because each piece was worth more than a commoner's house, it had to be guarded, catalogued, and occasionally rescued from the damage of daily life. The Queen's laundresses worked not only with water, but with smoke. When a gown began to carry the stale scent of its own importance, it was hung above trays of burning herbs, rosemary, sage, and sometimes cedar, to sweeten it. The smoke drifted upward, filling the fibres, and for a brief moment the room smelled almost sacred. Then the gown returned to duty, perfumed and absolved. To wear such clothing was both comfort and burden. The weight of velvet pressed against the shoulders, the tight stays shaped the breath, the ruff scratched the neck. Every movement required choreography. Rising from a chair meant lifting layers of history. Sitting meant rearranging them so that the seams didn't tear. The noise of fabric filled the air, the whisper of silk, the quiet protest of whalebone. It was fashioner's endurance test. But to those watching, the effect was miraculous. Elizabeth moved like a painting come to life. When she appeared before the court, light caught the pearls on her sleeves and scattered them across the room. Nobody thought of sweat or dust. They saw the Virgin Queen, immaculate, untouchable, and above all beautifully scented. Behind the scenes, the wardrobe rooms told a different story. There, servants worked through the night to maintain the illusion. They brushed, mended, perfumed. They placed sachets of clove and cinnamon between folds to keep moths away. And in the early hours, when the palace was quiet, the rooms must have smelled like a peculiar garden, half flower, half storage, the scent of labour disguised as purity. Sometimes, during royal progresses, Elizabeth brought dozens of outfits for a single journey. Each town expected a new costume, a new image of power. One day she was a maiden draped in white silk, the next a warrior queen in crimson and gold. Her subjects saw cleanliness as a moral quality. To appear fresh each morning despite travel and heat was proof of divine favour. So every perfumed hem became a kind of sermon. The body may tire, but majesty does not. It wasn't only the queen who lived through fabric. Courtiers copied her habits, spending fortunes on clothes they could barely afford, all of them reeking pleasantly of amber and hope. The entire court shimmered under candlelight, a hive of controlled brightness. And somewhere within that glow, the true scent of a life, of sweat, fear, and humanity, was carefully edited out. Still, the fabrics remembered. Servants said that when you opened the wardrobe doors, you could tell which gown had been worn to which event. One smelled faintly of smoke and rain from a stormy coronation night. Another carried a trace of the garden from an evening reception in June. Each dress was a memory sealed in cloth, as if the fabric had been quietly taking notes while everyone else was busy performing history. Sometimes late at night, the laundresses spoke softly about those memories. They said that when you worked close enough to the Queen's clothing, you could smell her moods. Joy had a lightness to it, like rosewater. Anger smelled sharper, like vinegar on the wind. And sorrow, they whispered, was almost scentless. Perhaps they were right. Clothes have a way of remembering what people try to forget. Even now, centuries later, the gowns that survive in museums still hold faint traces of the past. Not actual perfume, but the feeling of it, like air that hasn't quite decided to leave. And so, in the quiet halls of Hampton Court, or the glass cases of the V&A, the fabrics of Elizabeth's reign continue their work. They still teach silence, weight, and a lesson the Queen herself knew better than anyone. If you can't be clean, at least look unforgettable. The path now carries us toward what lived underneath those layers. The fragile machinery of beauty itself. The powders, the pigments, and the poisons that made immortality look like good lighting. From here, the story opens into the realm of perfume, where diplomacy floated not on words or treaties, but on the air itself. In Elizabeth's England, fragrance was not simply decoration. It was a message, an invisible letter written between the body and the world. Every scent said something about power, loyalty, or danger. Sometimes it said all three at once. Imagine the royal court at its busiest. The air so thick with perfume that it feels like velvet against your lungs. Courtiers glide through clouds of rosewater and ambergris, each trying to smell slightly more trustworthy than the next. The scent of the Queen, however, was unmistakable. Sweet, layered, and carefully measured. It arrived before she did, announced her without words, and lingered long after she left the room. Perfume was more than elegance, it was armour. The Queen's gloves were soaked in oils of jasmine, civet, and orange blossom, pressed between sheets of scented leather. When she raised a hand in greeting, the gesture carried a fragrance that made courtiers bow a little lower than usual. These sweet gloves, imported from Spain and Italy, were the height of fashion and the subject of quiet fear. Some whispered that the scent could conceal poison. The Queen herself, ever cautious, once refused a pear sent by a foreign noble until her advisor, Lord Cecil, confirmed they were safe. Even gifts had to be filtered through loyalty. To us, this might sound like paranoia, but in Tudor politics, smell was security. The right perfume could soothe, seduce, or intimidate. The wrong one could start a rumour strong enough to shake an alliance. A whiff of musk at the wrong moment might be mistaken for the smell of decay, a dangerous association in a court obsessed with moral purity. Elizabeth's perfumers were both chemists and courtiers. They mixed oils, resins, and flower distillations in tiny glass bottles, each batch recorded in guarded notebooks. Some recipes included amber, clove, bergamot, and the odd drop of civet musk, a substance collected from a small cat-like creature whose personal hygiene was, ironically, not exemplary. The animal's musk was aged, diluted, and reborn as something heavenly. A strange alchemy, filth transformed into luxury. In this, perfume mirrored politics. England itself was learning to turn corruption into elegance, to take the raw materials of empire, spice, sugar, silk, and distill them into something that smelled like virtue. When Elizabeth moved through her palaces, she carried that illusion with her. The air behind her became a promise that the kingdom was stable, orderly, and divinely blessed. Of course, not everyone appreciated this scented diplomacy. The Spanish ambassador once complained that he felt dizzy during audiences, claiming that Her Majesty's presence is thick with odour. He meant it as a critique, but in a court where fragrance equalled authority, his words only proved her success. To overwhelm was to rule. Perfume also softened the edges of ceremony. When Elizabeth knighted soldiers or received poets, the air shimmered with floral water, covering the less glamorous realities of close human proximity. The Tudor court had no concept of personal space, and everyone lived in each other's exhaled air. Fragrance made that tolerable. It was hygiene by illusion, politeness by diffusion. At times, the Queen herself composed small blends, instructing her servants to mix oils for the tempering of the air. One favourite included rose, thyme, and ambergris, a substance that came from the stomach of a whale but smelled like eternity. She burned it not only for pleasure but for protection. Doctors swore that sweet smells kept disease away. They were half right and entirely wrong at the same time. Beyond the palace walls, ordinary citizens mimicked the practice as best they could. Herbal pouches filled with mint and juniper dangled from belts. Housewives simmered vinegar and sage in iron pots to cleanse the wind. Apothecaries grew rich selling bottled airs. Smell became the great equalizer, the illusion that if you couldn't be rich, you could at least smell like you were trying. Within the palace, however, perfume had become a language. When the Queen sent a pair of scented gloves to a favoured courtier, it was more than a gift. It was permission. The scent on the leather was her invisible signature, binding its recipient to her favour. Some gloves carried a faint trace of amber and lemon, others musk and violet. A quiet vocabulary of power only a few understood. On feast days, the entire palace turned theatrical. Bowls of rose petals lined the halls, orange water sprinkled across floors, censers burning with resin. The air shimmered with heat and fragrance, a mixture so rich it blurred reality. Visitors wrote that entering the Tudor court felt like walking into a perfume bottle carved from sunlight and smoke. It was meant to impress, and it did. But hidden beneath the spectacle was a deeper truth. The more the court perfumed itself, the more it tried to escape what it really smelled like. In her private chambers, the Queen preferred subtler scents. Her bed linens were rinsed in rosewater, her hair combed with herbal infusions. Even the candles were perfumed, releasing notes of honey and lavender as they burned. Servants said the room always smelled faintly of flowers, even when no flowers were present. Perhaps that was the point. The smell of permanence, of control over decay. Yet perfume had its risks. Some mixtures were heavy with lead-based fixatives, meant to make the scent last. The same chemistry that preserved fragrance might have poisoned her slowly. But at a time when no one understood the danger, the glow of perfume was worth the risk. Better to die perfumed than to live ordinary. Perfume lingered as her invisible crown. It was the one thing she could command without words. In portraits, her painted face looked motionless, but in life, her scent moved through the room like an ambassador with no passport. She ruled through the air itself, a queen of atmosphere. And so, while other rulers wrote treaties, Elizabeth breathed them. Her politics were scented with jasmine. Her diplomacy carried in a waft of rose. It's difficult to say which lasted longer, the peace she negotiated or the smell she left behind. Our quiet exploration now turns toward. That fragrance will thicken. It will mix with smoke, sweat, and the less poetic parts of royal living. The palace that glittered above and stank below. For every sweet glove, there was a sewer nearby trying to keep up. Our story now drifts downward, to the quieter rooms below the perfume and politics. Every palace hides a truth, and for Hampton Court it was a very human one. Behind the velvet and incense there existed a constant question: where did everything go? Tudor cleanliness ended exactly where the plumbing began, which is to say, almost nowhere. Hampton Court, one of the grandest residences of Europe, could house several hundred people, yet its sanitation resembled that of a crowded ship. The elegant halls stood above a maze of cesspits, drains and trenches that carried the royal reality into the surrounding fields. When foreign ambassadors praised the splendour of England's queen, they did not mention that the roses in her gardens grew suspiciously well. At the heart of this delicate system was the Great House of Easement, an architectural marvel of discomfort. It contained more than a dozen wooden seats arranged over a common channel. Beneath it, waste trickled toward a large pit theoretically cleaned out by night soil men, though the records suggest enthusiasm for that job was limited. It was communal, aromatic, and democratic. Lords and ladies might plot policy side by side, each throne lacking only a crown. The Queen, of course, did not share this experience. Her private close stool was a masterpiece of upholstery, velvet padded, lidded and portable. It was in every sense a throne. And attending, it was one of the most trusted men in the kingdom, the groom of the stool. Despite the comic name, his position was no joke. He handled the most private aspects of royal life and often served as confidant, secretary and occasional financial advisor. Power, it turned out, could pass through very practical channels. The groom's duties included warming the seat, preparing linen cloths, and ensuring a constant supply of rosewater for the Queen's hands. He stood by with quiet discretion, and when the ritual ended he disposed of the evidence with the same care a clerk might give to a treaty. No documents recorded complaints from Elizabeth, which either means he was excellent at his work or that everyone involved knew better than to mention it. The stool itself was an object of fascination. Witnesses described its fine embroidery, its small silver handle, and the faint scent of herbs that clung to it. The chamber where it stood was often perfumed with juniper to mask the reality of its purpose. When the Queen travelled, the stool travelled with her, a symbol that even sovereignty required certain basic arrangements. Below the private chambers, the story grew less regal. Servants used long-handled buckets or simple wooden benches over pits. The air must have been thick with conflicting aromas: cooked meat from the kitchens, damp stone, burning torches, and whatever drifted up from the drains. It was a scent map of Tudor hierarchy. The higher you stood, the better the air. Water was drawn from the nearby Thames, a river that also carried waste from thousands of Londoners. When used for cleaning, it was mixed with vinegar or herbs to disguise its origin. The irony of washing royal floors with river water best avoided for drinking was not lost on anyone. But in a world where perfume ruled over plumbing, fragrance always won the argument. Flush toilets did exist by Elizabeth's time. One of her godsons, Sir John Harrington, famously invented a device for easing the body, a mechanical chair with a handle that released a rush of water to clear the bowl. He even installed one for the Queen in his home at Kelston. The idea delighted her for a few minutes, then horrified her advisors, who feared the sound of gurgling water might remind visitors that even monarchs participated in nature. The invention was politely ignored. The future would have to wait for quieter pipes. Within the palace, certain days were set aside for cleaning the cesspits. Windows were thrown open, carpets removed, incense burned by the pound. Workers lowered themselves by rope into the darkness. Their pay doubled for the day, though the smell, by all accounts, lingered far longer. The operation was noisy, dangerous, and oddly festive. Musicians were sometimes ordered to play in nearby halls to drown out the sounds. The Elizabethan court believed in many forms of illusion. This was one of the most necessary. Even the courtyards bore traces of royal waste management. Shallow, gutters ran along the edges, carrying runoff toward garden trenches. When it rained, the entire palace exhaled. Visitors arriving after a storm reported a certain earthiness in the air. In Tudor England, to smell the soil was to smell the system working. Yet, despite all this, the Queen's personal quarters remained astonishingly clean. Her attendants changed rushes on the floor every few days, scattering herbs like lavender and thyme among them. These fragrant rushes absorbed dampness and gave the illusion of freshness. When combined with the constant burning of scented wood, the result was almost convincing. In a way, the palace's plumbing reflected its politics, beautiful from above, precarious below. Everything depended on discretion and distance. The court believed that as long as unpleasantness remained unseen, or at least smelled of lavender, order was preserved. For Elizabeth, who built her reign on appearances, this was more than a matter of convenience, it was metaphor. The court itself functioned like her palace plumbing, hidden labour keeping the surface serene, each servant a moving part in a larger system that existed to make power look effortless. The groom of the stool was only the most literal example. There's something oddly touching about that small piece of truth. For all the pageantry of her reign, for all the divine imagery painted into her portraits, the Queen was still human. Her kingdom might have believed she never aged, never faltered, never sweated. But somewhere in the quiet rooms of Hampton Court, velvet met necessity, and even majesty had to exhale. Perhaps that's why she valued privacy so fiercely. The mask could only hold if no one saw the edges, and the edges, in her world, were built from pipes, buckets, and the occasional brave man with a shovel. From this still moment, the tale stretches gently ahead. The scene will move upward again, from the hidden chambers of necessity to the shining mirror of illusion. The same hands that managed waste also prepared cosmetics, grinding powders and mixing colours that promised eternal youth. And like the palace plumbing, those mixtures looked divine until you learned what flowed inside them. The path now carries us toward the mirror, where illusion became not just habit, but survival. In the winter of 1562, when snow lay heavy on Hampton Court, the Queen of England nearly died. She was 29 and at the height of her power, yet one tiny visitor decided to challenge her throne, a case of smallpox. It began quietly, as illness always does, a headache, a fever, a few red spots she hoped were nothing. By the end of the week, the palace had gone silent. No one spoke of it aloud, but everyone knew what smallpox could do. She recovered astonishingly. Her strength returned, her wit remained sharp, but the scars stayed. They were not deep, but deep enough to remind her every morning that even majesty had skin. For a woman who, ruled by image, a single blemish could be treasonous. She was not just a queen, she was an idea, and ideas were supposed to be flawless. From that moment, mirrors became complicated things. Painters, seeing her unease, began to help. They stopped recording and started inventing. Each portrait after 1562 carried less resemblance and more devotion. A smooth, pale face, bright eyes untouched by time, a tiny smile that looked like faith sculpted into paint. The mask of youth, they called it, though never to her face. Over the years, it became its own tradition. Painters didn't ask the Queen to sit anymore. They reused the same pattern, the same unchanging face pasted onto new costumes and new symbols. In one, she holds a sieve to show purity. In another, she stands on a map of the world, her untouched complexion glowing like the sun over England. The body aged, but the face stayed in permanent spring. It was a triumph of propaganda over biology. Every time a new ambassador arrived, he was greeted not by a woman of 40 or 50, but by the portrait that hung behind her. He bowed to the idea, not the person. That too was part of the plan. The court understood that if England's queen appeared ageless, then perhaps her power was ageless too. And if she could cheat time on canvas, she could cheat it in life, at least for a little while. Yet behind the stillness of those portraits was a flurry of invention. Cosmetics became the unseen workshop of the mask. Each morning, attendants applied mixtures to the royal skin, creating a surface smooth enough for myth to cling to. A pale glaze, a touch of rouge, a dusting of powder, the smallest alchemy in service of the grandest illusion. It was a performance, repeated daily, and the audience was both the court and the mirror. Visitors described her as bright as pearl, though few realised how literal that was. Pearl dust, crushed and mixed with vinegar, was rubbed into the skin to create that glow. Under candlelight it shimmered beautifully. Under daylight less so, but the Queen was rarely photographed by daylight. She preferred the glow of flame, which forgives almost anything. When the courtiers saw her in that soft light, their eyes adjusted to perfection. They saw what they wanted, and perhaps what she needed them to. Her closest attendants understood the truth. After hours of audience and ceremony, the makeup began to crack, the skin beneath aching from its own disguise. They would remove it layer by layer with cloth soaked in rosewater and vinegar, careful not to rub too hard. Sometimes the skin bled faintly from the friction. One maid wrote later that Her Majesty suffered the mirror as she suffered the crown. It was not vanity, it was maintenance of myth. Still, the ritual gave her power. When she faced her council, the pale mask turned every expression into command. Anger looked divine, weariness looked wise. The courtiers didn't see exhaustion, they saw eternity. And perhaps she began to believe it too. It is a dangerous thing to live behind an image for too long. Eventually, the image starts to believe in itself. The Queen's portraits grew stranger with age. The famous rainbow portrait, painted when she was over 60, shows her with skin as smooth as alabaster, her gown embroidered with eyes and ears, as if she could see and hear everything. In her hand, she holds a rainbow with the words, "No rainbow without the sun." It is a dazzling work, and a complete fiction, yet it remains the version of her we remember. In truth, the mask of youth wasn't just paint, it was policy. As Europe burned through religious wars and England survived conspiracies, her steady image told the people that their queen never faltered. To question the face was to question the nation, and so the mask held. But behind the marble skin, the woman still existed. She aged, she tired, she laughed at her courtiers' clumsy flattery. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she touched her face softly, as if testing whether the illusion still worked. It usually did. There is something tender about that gesture. The same hands that once held treaties and letters of war also held the edges of her own disguise. Every ruler wears a mask of some kind. Hers just happened to shine brighter than most. Later writers would call her vain, obsessed, even delusional. But those judgments belonged to an age with better lighting. In her world, a woman who ruled alone could not afford honesty with her own reflection. The mask was not pride. It was protection. And perhaps, as her reign stretched on, it became a kind of faith. After all, what is a mask if not a prayer that the world will believe what you need it to? The next breath of history leads us into, we'll look more closely at the ingredients that built that faith, the powders, the pastes, and the strange chemistry that made beauty both divine and deadly. Beneath the glow of the mask, something darker waited to be uncovered. If we follow the thread a little further, we arrive at the royal dressing table, a battlefield of jars, brushes, powders, and quiet danger. Here, beauty was chemistry, and chemistry was faith. The Queen's attendants began their work each morning with the calm precision of alchemists. They weren't simply painting a face, they were renewing a miracle that had to happen daily. On the table sat small containers carved from ivory or mother of pearl. Inside each, a different illusion waited. There was the pale paste, the red glaze, the shining film that made her skin gleam in candlelight. They looked harmless, soft, lovely, almost edible, yet each jar held something that no one fully understood. The white foundation that covered her scars was known as ceruse. To modern ears, that word sounds almost romantic, but the recipe was less so. It was made by suspending pieces of metal in vinegar until they softened, then grinding them into powder and mixing the result with water or oil. The metal was lead, of course, though they called it sweet white. It went on smoothly, left a luminous finish, and over time quietly poisoned the person wearing it. The red that followed was called vermilion, a colour made from quicksilver ground into dust. Today we know quicksilver as mercury. In her day, it was considered almost magical, the substance between solid and liquid, life and death. When mixed with oil, it produced a glowing scarlet that made lips and cheeks look alive, even when the person beneath was exhausted. It was beauty as defiance. The more toxic, the more convincing. Once the base and rouge were applied, a final glaze was added, a thin layer of beaten egg white, brushed gently across the face to create a sheen like polished marble. Under candlelight it looked divine, under sunlight it cracked like porcelain. But sunlight rarely entered her private chambers. The illusion was designed for darkness. To make the mixture cling longer, her perfumers sometimes added powdered alum or vinegar, both thought to preserve youth by tightening the skin. It did tighten, yes, so well that the skin beneath could barely breathe. After hours of court ceremonies, her face must have felt like a mask made of chalk. One contemporary wrote that Her Majesty's beauty endured the day, though it did not always reach the night. Even removing the makeup was perilous. It required strong solutions of vinegar and herbs, sometimes mixed with mercury again, this time in liquid form to dissolve the lead. The process burned slightly. The smell was sharp and metallic. Her attendants dabbed the cloths with gentle hands, careful not to rub too much. Each evening, the Queen endured her own unmaking. Then, the next morning, the ritual began anew. To us, it sounds like madness. To her, it was maintenance, the daily cost of divinity. Every flake of powder was a brick in the fortress of her authority. Pale skin meant distance from labour, from heat, from the sun itself. It said, "I do not work, I command." The irony is that this ideal of purity came from a place of decay. The powders that created that cold perfection were slowly damaging the skin beneath, drying it, cracking it, encouraging infection. But no one connected the dots. The more her complexion suffered, the more paint she required. The more paint she used, the sicker she became. It was a perfect circle of devotion. Courtiers, of course, copied her. Rooms full of ladies painted their faces with the same lead paste, sharing recipes like secret codes. One popular instruction began, "Take your sweet white and temper it with vinegar until smooth." The result was elegance and headaches, hair loss, trembling hands, and teeth that loosened with time. Yet to appear unpainted at court was social death. Better to shine like a saint than fade like a servant. The men were not immune either. Some wore light dustings of powder to match the Queen's radiance. Others carried perfumed handkerchiefs and applied a little rouge before banquets. The entire court glimmered like a theatre troupe performing eternity. And it worked, for a while. Visitors described Elizabeth as bright and youthful beyond her years. They saw what they were meant to see, the miracle of endless beauty. They did not see the effort beneath, the fatigue, or the quiet suffering that came from wearing divinity on bare skin. What makes this story strangely modern is how familiar it feels. The pursuit of perfection never dies, it simply changes packaging. The Queen's powders have become our filters, her rouge our digital glow. The materials are safer now, but the hope behind them remains the same. To be seen, to be believed, to hold back time with a little help from chemistry. Her attendants knew the cost, though they never said it aloud. Some noticed her trembling hands, her hair thinning at the temples, her skin pale not from fashion, but from exhaustion. Yet each morning, they ground the powders again, stirred the creams, whispered their small prayers to beauty, and began. There must have been a moment, perhaps near the end of her reign, when she looked in the mirror and saw not herself, but her creation, the woman she had become to the world. Pale, shining, untouchable, the mask of youth had turned into the mask of survival, and still she glowed. Not in a healthy way, but in the way of something that refuses to fade quietly. The kind of glow that comes from endurance rather than radiance. As the silence settles, another truth begins to surface, that endurance will take new forms, wigs, powders, perfumes, and all the quiet scratching that followed. The mask was only one layer of the performance. Beneath it, the machinery of beauty continued to hum, powdering hair, trapping insects, and keeping the illusion alive strand by strand. The path now carries us to the crown above the crown, the strange kingdom of Elizabeth's hair, or rather what stood in for it. In her youth, she had been known for her copper-red curls, thick and shining. Poets compared them to dawn light, though that may have been generous flattery from men trying to keep their heads attached. But after her illness in 1562, the same one that left its faint scars across her skin, her hair began to thin, slowly at first, then relentlessly. By middle age, the fiery curls had surrendered to time and treatment alike. Scorched by heat, strained by constant curling irons, and further punished by the powders and lead-based creams used to brighten her complexion. Hair, in the 16th century, was more than beauty. It was destiny. A queen's locks were her halo, the soft symbol of vitality and divine favour. To lose them was to lose part of the myth. So Elizabeth did what any sensible monarch would do. She commissioned new hair. Her wig makers were artisans of the highest order. They wove human hair, often taken from the heads of young women whose colour matched the Queen's natural red gold. Sometimes horsehair was blended in for strength, especially at the roots where the weight needed support. The wigs were curled, perfumed, and powdered until they looked less like something grown and more like something imagined. Records suggest she owned dozens of these creations, some for court appearances, others for travel, and a few for private days when ceremony still required majesty. But the body begged for rest. Each wig had a name and temperament. Some were flame bright, some softer and gilded. To wear one was to choose a mood: conqueror, maiden, saint, or storm. Attaching these masterpieces was no small affair. Servants first brushed and bound what remained of her natural hair tightly to her scalp, coating it with a thin layer of scented oil and sometimes a powder of herbs mixed with vinegar, meant to discourage the ever-present threat of lice. Then the wig was carefully pinned in place, heavy, elaborate, and very much alive. Beneath all that splendour the scalp must have itched like a secret nobody dared mention. Lice, unfortunately, respected no rank. They flourished in the padded wigs and rich fabrics of the court as cheerfully as they did in the poorer district of London. The difference was in the tools of control. The Queen's ladies used fine-toothed combs made of ivory or bone, dipped in vinegar to kill what the comb missed. The combing itself was almost ceremonial, rhythmic, methodical, occasionally punctuated by a quiet sigh when something unpleasant turned up. The Mary Rose, a warship from her father's reign, yielded dozens of such combs centuries later, still neatly crafted and designed for the same endless battle. Even the sailors carried them. Cleanliness, it seemed, was more ambition than achievement. For courtiers, the problem was concealed by ritual. Heads were dusted with perfumed powder, a mixture of ground starch, herbs, and sometimes orris root, which gave a faint violet scent. It brightened the colour, dulled the shine, and camouflaged whatever lived underneath. In a crowded hall glittering with candlelight, the air would shimmer with floating dust from 100 powdered heads, each exhaling the combined fragrance of rose, musk, and denial. Elizabeth's wigs were treated like relics. They were stored on wooden stands, brushed daily, and occasionally refreshed with new ribbons or jewelled pins. On feast days, the more elaborate ones might include small braids woven with pearls or tiny strands of gold thread. Each addition added weight. One wig weighed nearly 2 pounds. Her neck must have protested, though no one would have dared to mention it. To keep the illusion perfect, the Queen's hairdressers also dyed some of the wigs to maintain a uniform hue. Natural hair darkens with age, but hers did not. It stayed defiantly red, as though time itself obeyed her palette. The dyes were mixtures of saffron, henna, and sometimes a little sulphur, bound together with oil and left to rest for days. The smell was not entirely pleasant, but it told the court that transformation was in progress. There's a strange intimacy in imagining this process. The Queen sitting still while her attendants adjusted curls, pinned lace, brushed powder into every fold. The scratching of combs, the faint hiss of perfume spritzed from a cloth, the shuffle of slippers on the rush-covered floor. A dozen hands moving in silence to prepare one head of hair that wasn't quite hers. And yet, the result was spectacular. Under the golden light of the court, her wigs glowed like small suns. When she turned her head, the air caught on the curls and made them shimmer. The effect was theatrical, almost supernatural. Courtiers wrote that her very hair seemed to cast a light. It's easy to forget how much craftsmanship hid beneath that illusion. Wigs weren't just fashioned, they were engineering. They distributed weight carefully so that crowns and veils could rest without slipping. Some had internal wires to maintain height and shape. Others were built around soft caps to protect what remained of her real hair. All were expensive enough to fund a small village, but for all their grandeur, they carried the same truth as every other part of Tudor life. Comfort was optional, beauty was not. Under the layers of perfume and powder, the scalp still itched, the pins still pricked, and the heat of summer must have turned the whole apparatus into a private sauna. And still she wore them, daily, without complaint. A queen's head was not her own. It belonged to the crown, the portraits, and the people who needed her to look immortal. So the wig stayed, the powders thickened, and the air around her throne sparkled with the faint shimmer of floating starch. Somewhere between elegance and exhaustion she found balance. She may have been scratching beneath the jewels, but the legend never did. Our quiet exploration now turns from the crown of the head to the mouth that commanded nations, the smile that promised civility while hiding its own rebellion. Sweetness, decay, and diplomacy all met behind those painted lips. Our quiet exploration now turns to the mouth, that royal gate through which both charm and decree flowed. The smile of Elizabeth Anna was legendary, but not for reasons a dentist would applaud. In portraits, her lips are closed, serene, untouched by time. In life, they hid a battlefield. Sugar was the culprit. It arrived in England as treasure, fine white crystals imported from distant colonies and sold for more than their weight in gold. To eat sugar was to taste empire, and the Queen, like the rest of her court, was addicted to its symbolism. Sweet things meant victory, luxury, and control. Her tables glittered with marzipan, candied fruits, and sculptures carved from sugar paste. To refuse them would have seemed ungrateful to Providence itself. So she indulged quietly and thoroughly. Each bite was a small act of diplomacy, every banquet a performance of abundance. But sweetness carries its own politics, and the body keeps better records than courtiers do. Years of sugared almonds, honeyed wine, and spiced confections left their mark. The once brilliant teeth darkened, then blackened. Cavities deepened, nerves shrieked, and smiles became more strategic. There were no toothbrushes as we know them, only small wooden sticks frayed at the end, or metal toothpicks that looked more like weapons than tools. The Queen owned several sets, some made of silver and engraved with her initials. Her attendants kept them polished, though probably not effective. To freshen the breath, she rinsed with rosewater and clove oil, which disguised pain but cured nothing. Her physicians recommended that she rub her gums with powdered coral or burnt salt. Others suggested vinegar mixed with honey to draw out the worms. They meant cavities, but the word fits. Decay has its own creatures. One court chronicler recorded that her toothache was near constant, a phrase that manages to sound both polite and horrifying. There's a famous story, often told by dental historians, about Bishop John Aylmer. When the Queen feared the pain of having a tooth removed, the bishop volunteered to have one of his pulled first, just to show her it wasn't so bad. It was the kind of loyalty that only absolute monarchy could inspire. She laughed, perhaps nervously, and allowed the operation. One imagines the sound, the creak of wooden chair, the faint snap of metal, the sharp intake of breath. Dentistry was closer to carpentry in those days. Afterward, she was said to be relieved, but relief was temporary, and so the habit continued. More sweets, more rinses, more perfume to the rescue. Her breath, courtiers whispered, was still as commanding as her speeches, powerful but best admired from a distance. Among the nobility, blackened teeth eventually became a strange sort of fashion. To look as if you too could afford that much sugar was a mark of refinement. Some women even darkened their teeth deliberately with soot to imitate the Queen. It was the only cosmetic in history that made decay look desirable. Behind the elegance, however, the pain must have been relentless. There were days when she refused public dinners, preferring to eat alone, where she could chew carefully and maintain her composure. Wine helped, of course, as did soft foods, broths, puddings, and crushed fruits. These became the staples of royal dining when the teeth of the empire began to crumble. Still, she was careful never to show weakness. Audiences and ambassadors saw only the calm, closed mouth of authority. The voice that emerged was strong, commanding, and touched with a rhythm people later called musical. Perhaps it was practice, the natural music of someone speaking through discomfort. If we step quietly into her private chambers, we might see the nightly ritual unfold. A silver bowl of rosewater placed on the table, a cloth embroidered with small crowns, the faint smell of cloves and vinegar rising from the steam. The Queen dips a small brush, passes it delicately over her teeth, winces and continues. Servants stand nearby pretending not to notice. Cleanliness once again was performance. The symbolism of the mouth went far beyond hygiene. To speak was to rule. To eat was to embody plenty. The same lips that bit into sugared pears signed death warrants and treaties. When she smiled, courtiers saw civilization itself grinning back at them, even if the reality underneath was less divine. There is a peculiar honesty hidden in those blackened teeth. They were, in their own way, perfect metaphors for her reign. Brilliant, expensive, decaying beneath the polish, yet still dazzling enough to keep the world convinced. The cost of sweetness is always hidden until it's too late to refuse. Some physicians later speculated that the pain contributed to her temper. The sharp tongue of Elizabeth of Orleans might have owed as much to dentistry as to politics. It's easier to command an empire than to chew on one. But if her teeth hurt, her resolve did not. Even pain she turned into theatre. Visitors noted that her voice never faltered. It carried across the council chambers like music over a battlefield, steady, unwavering, bright as brass. Whatever the mouth suffered privately, the sound it made publicly was magnificent. When she died, accounts said her jaw was fragile, some teeth missing entirely. The royal surgeons, cautious with their descriptions, called her face gracious, though altered. That was their way of saying what history always knew. Beauty fades, but presence lingers. The smile that once conquered England remains closed in every portrait, a silence that hides a story of indulgence, resilience, and irony. It is the perfect Tudor ending, perfection sealed over pain, power disguised as politeness. The path now carries us onward, softly and inevitably. We leave the mouth and turn to the rest of the body, to the strange medicines that blurred the line between cure and curse, and the physicians who believed they could balance the soul by rearranging its fluids. From here, the story opens into the quiet world of Elizabethan medicine, a place where faith, fear, and imagination shared the same chair. In this age, doctors spoke the language of balance. They believed the human body was ruled by 4 invisible forces, the humours, each one a fluid with its own temperament: blood for warmth, phlegm for calm, yellow bile for anger, and black bile for sorrow. To stay healthy, you had to keep those temperaments in harmony. To fall ill meant that one had grown louder than the others. It was a poetic sort of science, the kind that sounded wise and smelled of herbs. Physicians treated not symptoms, but moods of the body. If you were melancholy, they said your black bile had become restless. If you blushed too easily, your blood was too bold. And if your face turned pale, as Elizabeth's often did, it meant the body's warmth had retreated inward. The cure was simple: persuade it to return. This persuasion took many forms. Bleeding was popular. Doctors believed that opening a vein allowed bad air to escape, like letting a house breathe after a long winter. The Queen's physicians performed it gently. A small incision at the arm or ankle, a silver bowl to catch what they called the excess. Afterwards they offered her sugared wine to renew the spirits, a touch of luxury to accompany the loss. Cupping was another favourite. Heated glass cups were placed on the skin to draw out invisible poisons. The suction left circular marks that looked alarming, but were worn almost proudly, proof that one had been purified. Elizabeth endured such treatments occasionally, though her attendants described them more as rituals than medicine. The Queen preferred to call them "my small repairs." Sometimes, however, medicine and beauty blurred completely. Her physicians prescribed ointments of mercury to soften the flesh and restore brightness. A delicate irony, since mercury had already found its way into her rouge. Yet the belief persisted that anything bright and quicksilver-like must contain life itself. They mixed it into balms for the skin, along with ground pearls, coral dust, and even crushed rubies, because sparkle apparently cured everything. When her complexion dulled, they applied poultices made from the warm bodies of pigeons, plucked, wrapped in cloth, and pressed gently against the face. The heat was meant to draw out impurities. To modern ears it sounds unsettling, but to her physicians it was mercy. Warmth, they said, encouraged the humours to behave. Elizabeth endured the procedure without complaint, sitting perfectly still while her attendants waited for the magic to work. For internal troubles, the recipes were just as imaginative. Distilled tonics made from gold leaf were meant to strengthen the heart. Pearl powder mixed with sugar cooled the passions. Ground coral, steeped in wine, promised protection against fainting. Each remedy glittered faintly, a pharmacy designed by a jeweller. If medicine couldn't cure, it could at least look expensive while trying, and there was comfort in the performance itself. Every potion came with ceremony. The grinding of mortar, the soft whisper of herbs crushed under pestle, the fragrance of rosemary and vinegar filling the air. The Queen's chamber became both sick room and stage. Servants watched silently as physicians murmured Latin incantations over small cups of coloured liquid, their breath fogging in the cool air. Whether or not the treatments worked hardly mattered. The rhythm of care was its own medicine. Her physicians also prescribed movement for melancholy. When sadness weighed on her, they recommended walks in scented gardens or rides through the countryside to open the lungs and the mind together. She took their advice. Those famous royal progresses, the great summer journeys from castle to castle, were in part medical therapy disguised as royal spectacle. The smell of grass and horses replaced the scent of wax and powder for a few blessed weeks. At court, lesser nobles followed her example. They purchased the same tonics, commissioned the same dangerous creams, and called it wellness. The entire aristocracy became a slow parade of glittering patients, all treating imaginary imbalances with very real poisons. But to question the system was to risk appearing ignorant, and nobody wanted to smell like ignorance. Elizabeth's own faith in her doctors was cautious. She trusted observation more than diagnosis. She often asked, "What say you of the air today?" If they answered clear, she smiled. If they said thick, she ordered fires burned with sweet herbs, as though purifying the kingdom through her chamber window. For her, medicine was both personal and political, an invisible way of commanding order from chaos. Behind all the strangeness, there was logic. In a world without microscopes, the senses were science. If something smelled clean, it must be safe. If it sparkled, it must be pure. If it burned slightly, it must be working. Medicine was measured in sensations, not results, and perhaps that was its real charm. The treatments might have been futile, but they gave comfort, the illusion of control in an unpredictable body. A queen who ruled by managing appearances could hardly resist a medicine that promised visible proof of healing. By the end of her life, her apothecary's shelves looked more like treasure chests than hospitals. Jars of amber, boxes of pearl dust, bundles of dried roses, flasks of red oil. Each item represented faith, not just in health, but in image, in ritual, in the idea that something beautiful must also be good. Modern readers might shake their heads, but we still live by softer versions of the same logic. Our jars are glass instead of gold. Our tonics smell of mint instead of mercury, yet the hope is unchanged. We still reach for beauty and call it medicine. In the stillness that follows, history turns the page again. That illusion will move from the doctor's table to the throne room, where health and holiness were displayed for all to see. There, every gesture became part of a ceremony, every handshake perfumed, every kiss mediated by fabric. Cleanliness transformed into etiquette, and the body itself became a sacred object that no one was allowed to touch. Our quiet exploration now turns to the hands, the most visible and yet the most carefully protected part of Elizabeth's body. They were the first to be seen and the last to be touched. In portraits, they rest lightly on a globe, a fan or a letter, poised in impossible stillness. The painters knew what her subjects believed. The Queen's hands were instruments of divinity. They signed life and death, blessed marriages, accepted vows, and waved armies into battle. To touch them was to touch authority itself. Of course, the truth, as always, was more earthly. Her hands were human, pale from years spent indoors, soft from careful protection, but not untouched by the passage of time. She knew this, and she managed it the way she managed everything else, through ritual. Before every audience, attendants arrived with bowls of warm water steeped in vinegar and herbs. The fragrance filled her private chambers, a blend of sage, thyme, and rose petals, sharpened by the faint sting of acid. The queen dipped her fingers one by one and wiped them gently with fine linen. It was more than cleanliness. It was a performance of moral order, a declaration that nothing impure would pass between ruler and ruled. After drying, she dusted her hands with a light powder to smooth the skin and disguise small blemishes. Her nails were cleaned with slender ivory scrapers, then polished with soft cloths until they shone. Finally, she drew on gloves. Always gloves. They were made of the thinnest Spanish leather, soaked in perfume and lined with silk. The scent depended on the occasion: orange blossom for diplomacy, jasmine for audiences, lavender for grief. Some were so richly decorated with pearls that they jingled faintly when she moved. These gloves were more than fashion. They were armour. They allowed her to handle gifts, letters, and even people without surrendering to the risk of touch. The glove was her border, soft, perfumed, and absolute. A kiss on the hand was never a kiss on the skin. It was a gesture directed toward a layer of leather and fragrance, a symbolic caress that left the person unsatisfied and the monarch unblemished. To kiss the queen's bare hand would have been unthinkable. Etiquette demanded distance. If she extended her hand, you knelt, bowed your head, and brushed your lips near the glove, never upon it. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the tension between reverence and denial. Intimacy in this world was strictly dry clean only. The custom spread through the court like perfume through a corridor. Soon every noblewoman wore gloves, and every handshake came with the faint rustle of leather. Gloves became language. To remove one was bold, to offer one was dangerous. A dropped glove might start a duel. A scented glove could seal a friendship or conceal a trap. The queen herself once received a pair from an admirer and smiled sweetly while her advisers quietly tested them for poison. None was found, only civet, musk, and the faint trace of obsession. The art of glove-making reached its height under her reign. Workshops in London and Bristol produced endless varieties, stitched with gold thread or embroidered with the Tudor rose. The scent came from long soaking in oils of jasmine, amber, or rose, then drying in the sun. Even unfinished gloves were considered valuable. The smell alone was a mark of rank. The craftsmen called them sweet armour, and they were right. In a world ruled by appearances, fragrance was the first line of defence. Elizabeth's own glove collection was famous. Visitors to court described her changing pairs several times a day, matching their colours to her gowns. During council meetings, she sometimes toyed with one glove as she listened, twisting it in her fingers, a gesture her advisers learned to read carefully. A glove held loosely meant she was amused. Folded sharply in half meant the discussion had gone far enough. Power spoke through silence and leather. But gloves were also delicate things. They trapped heat, sweat, and perfume together until the skin beneath softened too much. The queen occasionally suffered rashes on her wrists, which her doctors blamed on excess fragrance. She responded naturally by ordering even more perfume. To smell was to rule, to itch was merely human. When the gloves came off, in private before sleep, her attendants massaged her hands with oils of almond and myrrh. They rubbed lightly to restore circulation, then wrapped her fingers in linen soaked with rosewater. The room would grow still, the only sound the faint creak of leather being folded and stored away. It was a small moment of surrender, the brief meeting of skin and air. One night, as legend has it, a young maid forgot to bring the gloves to her bedside. When the queen noticed, she only smiled and said, "Then I shall dream unguarded." Whether true or not, the story feels right. Even she must have known that protection becomes exhausting. Her hands, despite their careful maintenance, were not merely symbols, they were tools. They wrote, gestured, pointed, punished, rewarded. They clapped for players and shooed away flies with equal grace, yet they were rarely idle. To keep them smooth was to keep the illusion intact. The symbolism reached its peak during public blessings. When she raised her hand over crowds, people swore they felt lighter. The gesture was so practiced, so precise, that it seemed almost divine. But the truth was simpler. The Queen had mastered her own body the way a musician masters an instrument. Every movement intentional, every pause part of the melody. In that sense, her hands were indeed fit for worship. Not because they were pure, but because they convinced everyone that purity still existed. From here, the story opens into another corner of her world. We step away from her quiet rituals and return to the larger air of the palace, an atmosphere thick with smoke, incense, and imitation. The court that surrounded her began to copy her mask, her scent, her gestures, until individuality itself disappeared into fragrance, and in that perfumed haze the line between health and hypocrisy became very hard to smell. Beyond this curtain of time, another scene waits. The air grows heavy. The Queen's perfumes have expanded beyond her body, filling the very corridors of the palace. It is no longer just Elizabeth who smells divine. It is the entire court, steeped in imitation. Every hall, every cushion, every sleeve breathes some version of her scent. If power has an odour, it is this, a mixture of rose, amber, smoke, and ambition. The Tudor court was a crowded world. Dozens of nobles, scribes, and servants shared the same air, each carrying their own cloud of fragrance and anxiety. Fireplaces smoked, candles hissed, food roasted, and torches burned tallow that released its own unholy sweetness. In winter, windows stayed shut to keep out the cold, trapping the air until it felt like another kind of body, one that pressed against the skin and lingered in the throat. To the people of her time, this was dangerous. They believed that sickness floated through foul air, a concept called miasma. Disease, they said, travelled on bad smells, the invisible ghosts of rot. The cure was simple, at least in theory: make the air smell better. When a plague threatened London, doctors ordered citizens to burn herbs and carry pomanders filled with clove and vinegar. The scent of survival was sharp enough to make eyes water. Inside the palace, the logic reached near religious heights. Courtiers waved scented handkerchiefs as if fencing off evil. Incense burners hung from iron chains, releasing spirals of smoke that climbed toward the painted ceilings. Candles made from beeswax mixed with cinnamon or frankincense flickered in every corner. At times the air grew so thick that one could barely see across a room. To them, it was proof of safety. To us, it sounds like slow suffocation by luxury. The Queen's chamber itself was a sanctuary of smell. It always held a faint fog of rosewater and ambergris, that strange waxy perfume drawn from the ocean's depths. Even the wooden panels of her walls were wiped with vinegar to discourage ill vapours. Her physicians swore that the scent of rosemary strengthened memory, and that burning juniper kept away disease. She believed them. The smoke rolled through the room, mingling with perfume until air and incense became indistinguishable. Visitors wrote that entering Elizabeth's presence was like stepping into another climate. "The very air is holy," one courtier said, though another, less poetic, described it as sweet to the point of dizziness. The Queen, of course, noticed neither. To her this was normal, the scent of order, the fragrance of authority. Clean air meant good government. Her courtiers followed the example with enthusiasm. They powdered their wigs, soaked their gloves in oils, and burned herbs in their rooms until every noble apartment smelled like a merchant's spice chest. Even the musicians who played for her wore perfumed ribbons around their sleeves. If you could smell the Queen's influence on someone, it meant you were standing close enough to power. And yet, all this fragrance carried a paradox. The heavier the perfumes, the worse the hidden air beneath them. The palace stank of smoke, sweat, and tallow, all politely disguised but never truly gone. The sweet layers on top were like paint on damp walls. No one could say where holiness ended and mildew began. Sometimes the illusion broke. On especially hot summer days, the air grew unbearable. Servants flung open the windows, and the sudden rush of wind carried the truth inside. The smell of the Thames, the market, the city's sewers. It was the reminder everyone pretended not to need, that the real England was not made of roses. Still, belief is stronger than evidence. Elizabeth herself kept small pomanders of silver and gold, filled with spices and amber, which she held to her nose during long ceremonies. When she addressed Parliament, she occasionally paused to inhale their comfort, as if drawing courage from the air. The gesture became famous, a sign of piety, not prudence. The court physicians encouraged these rituals. They measured the day's health by the day's smell. If the palace reeked of resin and flowers, the Queen must be well. If the smoke thinned, they feared contagion. Health became a matter of fragrance density. To survive was to stay pleasantly aromatic. Among courtiers, this logic took creative forms. Some stuffed their doublets with dried herbs, others perfumed their beards with rose oil. One nobleman even filled hollow beads with powdered spices, wearing them like tiny air filters. The effect must have been dazzling and unbearable. When too many gathered in one chamber, the combined scent was so powerful that people fainted, and immediately assumed the fainting was due to disease, which they tried to fix with even more incense. It was an endless circle. Perfume to prevent illness, illness imagined because of perfume, and more perfume to banish the fear. If there was a moment when the irony became visible, it was probably during the great banquets. Hundreds of candles lit, kitchens blazing, meat roasting, perfumes burning, courtiers sweating under heavy clothes. The air pulsed with heat, noise, and fragrance. Laughter mixed with coughing. Somewhere in the haze, Elizabeth sat serene, a fixed star in her scented cosmos. Her own odour, half divine, half human, guided the whole performance. And perhaps that was the point. In this fog of civet, candle wax and ambition, she became not just queen, but atmosphere itself. Her rule was no longer about the laws she wrote, but the air she created, the invisible field that surrounded everyone who came too close. When she moved, the court shifted like weather. When she was ill, the air turned heavy. When she smiled, the candles seemed brighter. It wasn't magic, only mastery of perception. She ruled through the senses, through the subtle power of how the world smelled and sounded. In the modern world, we disinfect instead of fumigate. But the impulse hasn't changed. We still believe that clean air is good air, that good air means virtue, and that virtue somehow smells nice. Elizabeth just believed it louder. The path now carries us towards something even stranger, the moment when scent became theology, when purity of air turned into purity of soul. In that world, to smell good was to be good, and to smell bad was to be suspect. It was faith bottled and burned, a religion that fit neatly inside a vial of jasmine oil. The path now carries us from superstition to belief, from the fear of bad air to the worship of good scent. By the late years of Elizabeth's reign, perfume had become more than comfort. It was conviction. In the same way that light was proof of heaven, fragrance became proof of virtue. The logic was simple and satisfying. Pleasant smells came from purity, and foul ones from sin. If a person reeked, their soul probably did too. The church preached it softly, the court lived it loudly. Smell was moral evidence, invisible, persuasive, and convenient. Elizabeth understood this perfectly. She had long since learned that scent could carry what words could not. Her fragrance was both shield and sermon. When she entered a hall, the air changed, a faint trail of roses, ambergris, and polished wood. Courtiers swore they could sense her before they saw her, as if holiness travelled ahead of her on the breeze. The poets called it the perfume of grace, though cynics might have called it stagecraft. One writer described the experience of standing near her as breathing faith itself. He wasn't entirely wrong. The Queen's scent had become theology, an argument in vapour. In an age when divine favour was constantly debated, she provided a physical answer. God's chosen woman must smell like paradise. Her portraits reinforced the idea. In the famous rainbow portrait, her gown blooms with embroidered flowers, her sleeve hides a coiled serpent of wisdom. Above her head is written a Latin phrase meaning no rainbow without the sun. The colours are bright, but the message is olfactory. Her presence brings freshness to the realm, the promise of renewal after storm. Poets leaned into the metaphor until it became canon. They wrote verses comparing her to lilies, roses, and spring gardens, their devotion perfumed with as much ambition as affection. One described her as the very air's delight. Another claimed that her breath commands the season. None of them mentioned the vinegar rinses, the candles, or the practical reality that every fragrance begins as something flammable. Still, it worked. The myth of the scented queen spread far beyond England. Foreign visitors returned home with stories of a monarch who seemed to glow and smell at once, as if her body emitted its own blessing. For a woman constantly navigating a world of male politics, it was an elegant strategy. She conquered, through atmosphere. And yet, there was danger in this theology of scent. Once purity became perfume, suspicion followed smell as well. When plague hit London, the poor were accused not only of spreading disease but of spreading stench. Their poverty became a crime of the nose. Laws were written to control who could burn which herbs, who could afford soap, who could smell respectable. The hierarchy of hygiene hardened. Within the palace, the moral divide was even sharper. Servants who handled waste or laundry worked in a separate wing, far from the perfume chambers. They were necessary but invisible, ghosts who carried away the physical cost of sanctity. The Queen's clean air was purchased with their sweat. It was a fact everyone knew and no one said aloud. Elizabeth herself may have sensed the hypocrisy. In letters, she occasionally complained about the noisome airs of certain residences and asked that new herbs be brought, or fresher things. The request reads simple enough, but the tone suggests weariness. Even she must have known that holiness, when bottled, eventually spoils. Still, she doubled down. Every ceremony, every progress, every speech was accompanied by clouds of scent. Before she entered a room, servants walked ahead burning herbs. After she left, courtiers lingered in the aroma like worshippers after Mass. Some said the lingering smell was a sign of her divinity. Others whispered that it was her disguise. There's something deeply human in that contradiction. We perfume what we fear: decay, mortality, the quiet truth that even the most powerful bodies share the same chemistry as everyone else. Elizabeth simply perfected the art. She made denial smell beautiful. During the later years of her reign, when her strength began to wane, the symbolism grew stronger. The realm itself was said to breathe sweetly under her rule. Pamphlets praised the fragrant peace of England. Poets compared her to incense rising from an altar. Politics had become scented devotion, and the Queen was its high priestess. One court poet, ever eager to please, wrote a sonnet describing her perfume as a spiritual experience. Her presence turns the air to prayer, each breath a gentle psalm. It's unclear if she read it, but if she did, she probably smiled. She knew flattery when she smelled it. By now, the association between scent and virtue had reached absurd heights. Even letters sent by the Queen were sprinkled with perfume, as though their aroma might convince distant allies of her goodwill. When a treaty arrived from France, courtiers remarked that the ink smelled of musk, a fact they treated as suspiciously French. Diplomacy had turned into a perfume contest. And yet, beneath all the irony, there's something almost beautiful about the idea. To live in a world where the moral order was carried on the air, where holiness could be inhaled, where a single breath might link heaven and earth, that's a kind of poetry few ages can sustain. For Elizabeth, that poetry was practical. It masked sickness, age, and fear. It made her untouchable, both literally and spiritually. Her scent was her aura, her argument, and her defence. She was the divine nose of her nation. If she smelled pure, the realm was safe. Faith, politics, and deodorant, inseparable since 1558. As the candles burn low and the air in her chamber grows heavy with sweet smoke, we can almost sense the fatigue beneath the fragrance. The Queen sits surrounded by her miracles of scent, the air trembling with the weight of her own myth. And somewhere beyond the perfumed walls, England breathes with her, half in faith, half in habit. Our quiet journey now moves toward the twilight of that reign, when the scent that once symbolized eternity began to fade into dust and memory. The fragrance remained, but the body behind it was growing tired. Our quiet journey now moves toward the final years, when the scent that once promised eternity began to cling a little too closely to the room. The Queen who had once defined purity through perfume was growing older, and the illusion required more work than ever before. In her youth, fragrance had been her crown. Now it was her disguise. Each year demanded another layer, more powder, more rosewater, more carefully placed jewels to draw the eye away from what time had begun to take. Her attendants noticed the change before she did. The jars on her dressing table multiplied. The air in her chambers thickened, sweet as a garden that had forgotten to die for winter. Her body began to send its quiet reminders. The aches in her hands, the tremor that touched her letters, the headaches that came from long hours under heavy wigs and tight collars. But pain, like odour, could be masked. Her doctors offered tonics that smelled of cloves and cinnamon, tinctures that promised to brighten the spirits and strengthen the heart. They mostly strengthened denial. By the mid-1590s, the Queen had started to avoid mirrors. She ordered some covered with silk when not in use, as though reflections were contagious. When she did face them, it was only under the forgiving light of candles. Daylight was less diplomatic. It showed too much of the truth. In paintings, of course, she remained untouched, the immortal face of her people. But in private, the mask of youth was cracking. Each morning, the ritual took longer. The foundation paste was thicker now, the rouge more vivid. Her ladies applied powder with feather brushes, layer upon layer, until the skin beneath could barely breathe. Afterward, they perfumed her neck and hair with orange blossom and husk, the smell of vitality bottled by memory. The effect was almost theatrical. She shimmered like a relic, freshly polished for procession. Those who saw her up close noticed the fatigue behind the radiance. The voice still carried command, but its music was slower. The laughter that once scattered, courtiers now came less often, and when it did, it was quieter, as though she was laughing through layers of silk. She remained formidable, but the myth had grown heavier than the body that carried it. The court, of course, pretended not to notice. They described her as unchanged and ever glorious. To admit otherwise was political suicide. Painters continued to copy the same pattern of her ageless face, a design first sketched 30 years earlier. The difference between her portraits and her reflection grew wider each season, but no one dared to bridge it. Her private moments were gentler. At night, when the candles burned low and the room smelled of lavender and wax, she sometimes sat awake in silence. The perfumes that had once energized her now seemed almost oppressive. The air, thick with sweetness, pressed close. Servants wrote of her long vigils, sitting motionless by the fire wrapped in shawls, as if listening for something only she could hear. Perhaps it was the sound of her own legend settling into stillness. Her personal physician recorded bouts of sleeplessness. He recommended soft music and calm airs, meaning perfumed smoke of cedar and thyme. She allowed it, though the fumes often made her eyes water. Tears were easier to explain when they smelled like herbs. By then, her teeth had nearly gone, her appetite had faded, and yet she clung fiercely to grace. The courtiers who attended her final progresses spoke of the effort it took for her to appear strong, the hours of preparation, the fatigue hidden under powdered calm. Still, when she rode through the cheering crowds, the myth worked. The people saw only the queen, radiant, untouchable, eternal. There is tenderness in that kind of persistence. She must have known that her youth had long departed, but she refused to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing its shadow. To age quietly was one thing. To age publicly, as a symbol of a nation, was another. So she layered the rosewater, tightened the ruffs, brightened the lips, and went on. If the body protested, it was ignored. In those final winters, her rooms grew smaller. She dismissed the musicians earlier, avoided banquets, and surrounded herself with women she trusted. They spoke softly, tended to her comfort, and kept the fires burning through the night. Visitors described the glow of her chamber, the pale flicker of candles mirrored on polished brass, the steady hum of warmth and lavender. It smelled, one wrote, like a shrine that had forgotten its saint. When illness finally began to take her, she refused to lie down. To recline was to admit defeat. For days she stood or sat in her chair, still dressed, still composed, surrounded by the scent of her own endurance. Her courtiers begged her to rest, she waved them away. The word must match the woman, she said once, and the woman does not yield. By the end, she was all scent and shadow, a legend breathing through the last hours of light. The air in her room must have been almost solid with perfume, the culmination of a lifetime spent trying to turn mortality into fragrance. Her attendants later said the chamber smelled of roses for days after she passed. Perhaps it did, or perhaps they simply couldn't imagine her leaving without leaving her scent behind. And yet, there's something profoundly human in that lingering sweetness. Beneath all the ceremony and illusion, the perfume was never just decoration. It was her memory, her defense, her unspoken prayer against oblivion. She had lived by controlling the air around her, and in the end, the air was what remained. As the last candle fades and the perfume thins, the story turns one final time, away from the woman herself and toward what survived her. The myth of immaculate royalty, the illusion of purity, the power of scent that outlived the body. As the last candle fades and the perfume thins, we arrive at what remains, not the woman, but the atmosphere she left behind. The reign of Elizabeth ended as it had begun, with fragrance, ritual, and rumour. Her death in 1603 did not end her presence, it merely changed its form. The scent lingered longer than the breath that made it. In the days after her passing, courtiers whispered about the air in her chamber. Some said it still smelled faintly of roses and amber, others that it had turned sour, like a perfume left uncorked too long. The truth was probably somewhere in between. For nearly half a century she had lived surrounded by burning herbs, scented candles, and painted powders. The room had absorbed her. The walls themselves remembered her chemistry. Her servants, when questioned later, gave different versions of those final moments. One said she looked still and serene, another that her colour was fair, though wan. What they all agreed on was the silence. The air, always thick with scent, now held a kind of stillness that felt unnatural. Perhaps that's what happens when a myth exhales for the last time. Outside the palace, London carried on as it always did. Crowded, noisy, smelling of smoke, animals, and bread. The city had never shared the Queen's obsession with fragrance, yet even there, her death left a trace. People spoke of her as if she were a season that had ended, a long perfumed summer, heavy and golden. In time, her belongings were catalogued. The ledgers from her wardrobe read like a map of the senses. Dozens of gowns scented with herbs, boxes of gloves soaked in jasmine oil, bottles of rosewater, containers of white powder, and a collection of pomanders shaped like tiny crowns. Each item was part relic, part laboratory sample, the residue of a life spent turning mortality into ritual. Her myth, of course, bloomed immediately. The Virgin Queen, the goddess of the English Golden Age, the immortal monarch whose very presence had purified her realm. Painters and poets embalmed her in words and colour, smoothing away the exhaustion, painting out the tremor, sealing her forever in candlelight. Even death was edited for continuity. But behind the poetry, the human story remained. Servants remembered the damp towels that carried away her makeup at night, the vinegar bowls that smelled of effort and fatigue, the strange mixture of holiness and exhaustion that filled her rooms. For every poet who wrote of her divine fragrance, there was a laundress who remembered the weight of her linen and the ache in her own hands. The myth of cleanliness, like the perfume that built it, depended on invisible labour. Historians still debate how clean Elizabeth really was. Some argue that by the standards of her age, she was unusually hygienic, that her insistence on fresh linen, herbal baths, and perfumed air made her almost modern. Others point out that her cosmetics and tonics did as much harm as good. The question, however, may miss the point. Cleanliness for her was never about health, it was about performance. Purity was not a state to be achieved, but an illusion to be maintained. What she perfected was not hygiene, but the theatre of it. Every cloth, every scent, every polished glove was part of a story. A narrative in which the Queen stood above the ordinary decay of humanity. It was propaganda disguised as grace. Yet even propaganda has its beauty. It reassures, it soothes, it tells the weary that someone somewhere is still untouchable. Centuries later, visitors to museums still pause before her portraits. They see the flawless face, the pale hand resting on a globe, the elaborate gown that looks both heavy and weightless. No one smells the lead, the vinegar, or the sweat beneath the jewels. The eyes of the paintings remain calm, distant, eternally fresh. The illusion holds, and maybe that's what she wanted. Not perfection, but permanence. To be remembered as something that never spoiled. It is a deeply human wish, shared by anyone who has ever stood in front of a mirror and hoped the reflection might freeze in place. She simply had the resources to make it official policy. The scent of power survived her in more ways than one. Her successors inherited her court's obsession with perfumed air, its rituals of appearance, its unspoken fear of decay. The Stuarts may have changed religion and politics, but they kept the candles burning. The English monarchy itself would remain a scented fiction for centuries, polished, powdered, and slightly unreal. Even now, the language of her myth lingers in the air we breathe. We still speak of clean reputations, sweet success, the stench of scandal. We still link goodness to freshness, corruption to odour. Somewhere in our collective imagination, Elizabeth's ghost still dictates the vocabulary of virtue. And perhaps that is her truest legacy. Not the empire or the politics, but the lingering belief that appearance can rewrite reality, that fragrance can erase time. It's a comforting illusion, and like all good perfumes, it fades slowly. Imagine for a moment standing in one of her old chambers. The tapestries smell faintly of dust and wax. The sunlight filtering through the windows warms the wood, releasing traces of something floral that shouldn't still exist. You breathe in, and for a heartbeat she returns, not as a queen or a legend, but as a scent, bright, fading, human. In the end, that may be the closest anyone comes to immortality, not in marble, not in memory, but in the air itself. that brief sweet interval between presence and disappearance. And that somehow is how it all made sense back then. A queen built her eternity from smoke and rosewater, and the world believed her. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived another century of illusion. If you're asleep, even better. You're breathing in the last of her perfume, and it's doing exactly what she intended, making you forget for a moment that everything real eventually fades.